There was a moment, sitting in a vinyl chair under fluorescent light, when a single line on a hospital form rearranged 22 years of my life. Type O positive. My son was O positive. I was AB negative. Diane was a positive. Nobody said a word out loud. The nurse just kept typing on her keyboard, unaware that she was typing the first sentence of an entirely different story than the one I thought I was living. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't ask a question. I just sat there and watched a stranger's biology hover over a life I had spent 22 years believing was mine. My name is Marcus Bennett. I'm 49 years old. I live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood outside Denver, Colorado, in the same 3-bedroom house I've owned for 18 years, the one Diane and I finally paid off 11 months before any of this happened. I've spent the last 23 years working my way up at a regional logistics company, and for the last 6 of them I've run operations across 4 states out of an office with my name on the door. Diane and I have been married 22 years. We have one son, Ethan, who was, until that afternoon in the hospital, the single most uncomplicated fact of my adult life. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't raise my voice at dinner tables, and I've never once, in over 2 decades of marriage, slammed a door. Most weekends you'd find me refinishing something in the garage or driving Ethan to a friend's house, living the kind of unremarkable, dependable life I'd always assumed was the whole point. People who know me would tell you I'm the kind of man who reads the instructions twice before he starts anything. That habit, as it turned out, was about to matter more than I ever expected it to. Diane and I met at a community college night class in accounting, back when we were both 26 and starting over after directionless 20s. She was sharp, funny in a dry way, unimpressed by anything I tried to perform for her, which is exactly why I fell for her. We married 18 months later in her parents' backyard in Fort Collins, 40 guests, a borrowed sound system, a cake her aunt made that leaned slightly to the left. It felt, at the time, like the start of something solid, the kind of solid you don't question again for a long while. We built our life the way most people I knew built theirs, slowly, on installments. I took the logistics job at 28 and never left it. Diane worked as a dental hygienist for a decade before cutting back to part-time when Ethan was born. We bought the house on Larkspur Court when Ethan was 2, a modest 3-bedroom with a crooked chimney and a yard big enough for a swing set, and spent the next 16 years paying it down one mortgage statement at a time. 11 months before the hospital form, I made the final payment. Diane framed the notice from the bank and hung it in the hallway, right next to Ethan's kindergarten photo. Standing there, I remember thinking we had actually done it, built something that couldn't be taken from us. Around the neighborhood, ours was the kind of marriage other people pointed to. Diane ran the fall fundraiser for Ethan's old elementary school for 9 straight years. I coached his rec league baseball team until he outgrew it, and I still had a folding chair in my truck with his team's faded logo on the back. We had dinner with the same 2 couples every other month for over a decade. None of that felt like performance. It felt like proof, the accumulated, boring, reliable proof of a marriage that had simply worked. Ethan was, by any measure, the center of both our lives. He was a quiet boy, methodical, more interested in taking apart the toaster than playing outside, and I used to joke that he got that from me. He grew into a serious, kind 19-year-old who was 6 weeks into his sophomore year at Colorado State when the fatigue started. Small things at first, missed classes, dark circles under his eyes, a complaint about his ankles swelling that he mentioned almost as an afterthought over Sunday dinner. Diane pushed for a doctor's visit. I remember being irritated at the inconvenience of it, the way you're irritated at things before you understand what they actually are. The diagnosis, when it came, was IgA nephropathy, a kidney condition the specialist explained slowly, the way doctors do when they know the words are about to matter. Ethan's kidney function was declining faster than anyone expected for someone his age. Within 4 months, the conversation had moved from monitoring to transplant. When the specialist mentioned that a living donor from within the immediate family carried the best long-term odds, I didn't hesitate, and neither did Diane. We scheduled the blood typing for both of us on the same Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting 2 chairs apart in a waiting room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet, holding hands the way we used to when we were young and still nervous about things. I remember the drive to that appointment more clearly than almost anything else from that entire year. Diane quiet in the passenger seat, Ethan in the back with his headphones in, the three of us moving through an ordinary Tuesday toward a routine blood draw none of us expected to matter. I want to be clear about something. I was not looking for trouble that day. I had no reason to be. 22 years is a long time to build trust, and I had never once had cause to question it. I was there because my son needed a kidney, and I was prepared to give him mine without a second thought. That is the frame of mind I was in when the nurse came back with the results and read the numbers off the screen in a tone that was careful in a way I didn't understand yet. I want to double-check something before we go further, the nurse said, angling the monitor slightly away from us, the way people do when they're buying themselves a moment to think. Mr. Bennett, can you confirm your blood type for me? Have you had it typed before? I told her AB negative. I'd known that since a blood drive in college, one of those facts you carry around without ever needing it. She nodded, typed something, and asked Ethan the same question. Oh, positive, he said, reading it straight off his own chart. She asked Diane a positive. The room didn't change temperature. Nobody gasped. It was quieter than that, a kind of stillness that comes from three people doing math at slightly different speeds. I did mine first, I think, because I'd spent 23 years in logistics running probability models for a living. AB negative and a positive, as parents, cannot produce a child with type O blood. It isn't a rare exception. It's a biological wall. I looked at Ethan, who was scrolling his phone, oblivious, waiting for someone to tell him what came next in his treatment plan. I looked at Diane, who was staring at the intake form like it had personally insulted her. She didn't look at me. That's the detail I keep coming back to, not what she said, because she said nothing, but the half-second she spent very deliberately not meeting my eyes. It happens sometimes with typing errors, the nurse said carefully, in the voice of someone who has said this sentence before and knows it isn't usually true. We can redraw and confirm, if you'd like some peace of mind before the donor screening continues. I said that sounded reasonable. My voice came out level. I remember being almost surprised by that, the way you're surprised your hands aren't shaking when you expected them to be. I asked a few practical questions about the donor screening timeline, thanked the nurse, and walked out to the parking garage with my wife and my son like nothing at all had just happened in that room. In the elevator down to the parking level, Ethan complained about the cafeteria coffee and asked if we could stop for real food on the way home. Diane laughed at something he said, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, and for a moment I almost let myself believe the nurse was right, that it was nothing more than an old clerical mix-up, the kind of thing hospitals correct with an apologetic phone call a week later. Then I remembered the half-second she hadn't looked at me, and I understood, somewhere underneath the part of my brain that was still making small talk about drive-through options, that I already knew what the redraw was going to confirm. I didn't say anything to Diane that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy yet, not really. It was that I genuinely didn't know what I would do with an answer if I asked the question out loud, and some instinct told me that once I asked it, I couldn't unask it. So instead, I did what I've always done when a number doesn't add up at work. I gathered more information before I said a single word to anyone who might be affected by it. I called my brother-in-law, Paul, Diane's older brother, who'd been an ER physician for almost 20 years. I framed it as a general curiosity, genetics, blood typing, how reliable it really was. Paul, who has never once in his life missed the actual question underneath a question, was quiet for a moment before he said, "Marcus, is this about you, or is this about somebody else?" I told him I wasn't ready to say. He didn't push. He just told me, plainly, that clerical blood typing errors happen, but that ABO incompatibility between two named biological parents and a child is not something a lab mistake explains away. If I wanted certainty, he said, a paternity test, the cheek swab kind, done privately, results in fewer than 2 weeks, would tell me everything the blood type couldn't. 2 days later, I called an old friend from college, Rob Alvarez, who'd become a family law attorney in Boulder. I didn't tell him why I was asking either. I asked him, hypothetically, how paternity findings interacted with things like a family home, a retirement account, and a son who was legally an adult. Rob, who has represented enough quietly falling apart marriages to recognize the shape of one over the phone, told me something I've held on to since. The law doesn't care how you feel about it. It cares what you can prove and when you proved it. Get your facts first. Feelings can wait. He also told me something else, almost as an afterthought, that I didn't fully appreciate until much later, that in his experience, the people who came to him early, before they'd said anything to a spouse, ended up with cleaner outcomes than the ones who confronted first and called a lawyer second. Emotion is expensive in a divorce, he said. Documentation is free. I wrote that down on a legal pad I kept in my truck, the same pad I used for shipping discrepancies at work, and I ordered the test kit that same week, had it shipped to my office instead of the house, and told no one, not Paul, not Rob, not Diane, exactly when I planned to use it. I went to work the next morning and ran a routine 4-state freight audit like it was any other Tuesday, because in every way that mattered to anyone watching me, it still was. I collected Ethan's sample under the cover of a routine cheek swab the transplant team had already scheduled for tissue typing. I simply added my own to the same envelope and mailed it to the private lab myself before anyone else saw it. It felt strange, standing at a mailbox 2 blocks from my own house, sealing an envelope that would either confirm the life I'd built or dismantle it. I told myself I was being thorough. I don't think I believed that even as I thought it. The following week, Diane started coming home late from the dental office where she still worked 3 days a week. Nothing dramatic, 20 minutes here, 40 there, but I've balanced enough operational schedules in my career to notice a pattern breaking. When I asked casually, over dinner, she said Dr. Reyes had added evening appointments to make up for lost revenue during flu season. It was a reasonable answer. I wrote the license plate of a car I didn't recognize, parked 2 houses down from ours on a Tuesday evening, into the Notes app on my phone anyway. 10 days after the exam room, on a Thursday night I remember specifically because it was garbage night, I was looking for a phone charger in the hallway closet and found an old shoebox of photographs Diane kept from before we were married, pictures I'd seen 100 times over the years without really looking at them. This time I looked. There was a photo from a company holiday party, 1997, 2 years before we married, showing Diane laughing next to a man I didn't recognize, his hand resting on the small of her back in a way that friends don't usually rest their hands. On the back, in her handwriting, was a single word and a date. Daniel, December 97. I put the photo back exactly where I'd found it and closed the box. I didn't confront her. I want to explain why, because I know how that looks from the outside. I had 1 piece of biology, 1 photograph, and 1 unfamiliar car. None of it on its own proved anything. And I had learned, over 23 years of solving supply chain problems for a living, that the worst thing you can do with an incomplete picture is act on it loudly. So I kept building the picture instead. I asked Diane, gently, one evening, whether she'd ever kept in touch with anyone from her old dental supply job, the one she'd worked before we married. She said no, hadn't thought about those people in years, and changed the subject to Ethan's surgical prep checklist. I noted the date and moved on. Thanksgiving came 12 days later. Diane's whole family gathered at our house. Paul and his wife, Diane's mother, 2 cousins Ethan had grown up alongside. I carved the turkey the way I do every year, and Diane's mother told the same story she tells every Thanksgiving about the year the gravy caught fire. From across the table, I watched Diane laugh at exactly the right moments, refill wine glasses at exactly the right pace, perform the version of our life she'd been performing for 22 years. At one point, Paul caught my eye across the table, just for a second, and I understood, without either of us saying anything, that he'd been thinking about our phone call every day since we'd had it. The week after Thanksgiving, I drove past the address on the license plate I'd written down, not out of any plan, just a Sunday afternoon errand that happened to take me 2 streets over from where I'd seen the unfamiliar car. It was a modest ranch house with a for sale sign that had been there long enough to fade. I sat in my truck for exactly 4 minutes, told myself I had no business doing what I was doing, and drove home. I never mentioned it to Diane. I never mentioned it to anyone. It went into the same mental ledger as the photograph and the blood type, one more entry in a column I was quietly building toward a total I already suspected. Somewhere in that same stretch, I started running into small contradictions I might have missed in an ordinary year. A dentist's office holiday card that thanked patients for another wonderful year with Dr. Reyes and the team, Dated the week Diane had told me the office was struggling with lost revenue small things. The kind of thing you'd forgive instantly in a marriage you weren't already quietly auditing. Diane's evening appointments continued through early December, and I started noticing the smaller tells that come with a person managing two versions of a story. She'd mentioned Dr. Reyes's office by a different closing time on different nights. She'd leave her phone face down on the counter, something she'd never done in 22 years of marriage, not because she was hiding anything before, but because she'd never needed to. Once, folding laundry, I found a receipt from a coffee shop across town, time-stamped on a day she'd told me she was at her mother's. I photographed it with my phone and put it back in the pocket of the jeans I'd found it in, exactly where it had been. I want to be honest that this period tested every ounce of restraint I had. There were nights I lay awake next to her, listening to her breathe, running the math over and over, the blood types, the photograph, the time-stamped receipt, and wanting badly to just ask her outright and be done with the not knowing. But every time I got close to that impulse, I thought about what Rob had said. Documentation is free. Emotion is expensive. So I kept a small notebook in my truck's glove box instead of my head, dated and factual, the same way I logged freight discrepancies at work. No editorializing, just what happened and when. Ethan's pre-transplant appointments continued on schedule through all of this, and in every one of them, Diane was, by any outside measure, a devoted mother, asking sharp questions of the nephrologist, tracking his lab values in a spreadsheet she kept on her laptop, sitting up with him on the nights his nausea from the new medication got bad. Watching her care for a son whose paternity she'd apparently wondered about for years was its own strange kind of vertigo. It made me angrier, in a way, than the affair itself eventually would, not that she'd made a mistake decades ago, but that she'd built an entire, convincing performance of certainty on top of a question she'd never let herself answer. One night in early December, I came home later than usual after a shipment delay at the Cheyenne Depot, and found Diane sitting alone at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she hadn't finished, staring at nothing in particular. She looked, for just a moment before she noticed me in the doorway, like a woman carrying something heavy enough that she'd forgotten to hide the weight of it. "Long day?" I asked. She said something about work, about Ethan's surgery date moving up, about being tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. I sat down across from her and asked, gently, if there was anything she wanted to tell me. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than the question warranted, and said no, she was just tired. I said okay. I meant it in the sense that I wasn't going to push. I didn't mean it in the sense that I believed her. The DNA kit's results were due back any day. Diane didn't know I'd sent anything at all. Ethan, for his part, seemed to be improving slightly on the medication bridging him to surgery, blissfully unaware that his own biology had become the center of a quiet investigation his father was running without his knowledge. I kept the lawyer's number saved under a fake contact name in my phone. I kept the photograph's existence to myself. I kept the notebook in the glove box, growing by a line or two each week. I kept showing up to work, running my four-state operation, signing off on shipping manifests, being, to every observable measure, exactly the same man I had been for 23 years. Only I wasn't. I was a man waiting for an envelope, and I had gotten very good, in a short amount of time, at looking like I wasn't. The envelope from the lab sat on the corner of my office desk for 6 days before I opened it. I told myself I was busy. That wasn't true. I moved it once, to make room for a stack of shipping manifests, and left it face down under a stapler for 2 more days after that, as if the report itself might lose some of its power if I didn't have to look at the return address. I think some part of me understood that the moment I opened it, I would know something I could never again not know, and I wanted 6 more days of the life I'd had before that Tuesday in the exam room, even if, by then, I already understood exactly what it was going to say. I opened it alone at my desk after everyone else had left the office on a Tuesday evening. The report was 2 pages, mostly statistical formatting, and one line that mattered. Probability of paternity, 0%. I sat with it for a long time before I drove home, past the ranch house with the faded for sale sign, past the coffee shop from the time-stamped receipt, taking the long way for no reason I could have explained to anyone. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already decided I wasn't going to say a single word until after Ethan's dinner. Whatever else was true, that Saturday belonged to my son, not to the 2 pages folded in my jacket pocket. Ethan's pre-surgery family dinner was scheduled for that Saturday. A small gathering Diane had organized to mark the week before his transplant, with Paul and his wife, Diane's mother, and Ethan's girlfriend all crowded around our dining table. I said nothing through the meal. I passed the potatoes. I laughed at Paul's joke about the Broncos. I watched Diane again perform the role she'd performed for over 2 decades, and for the first time in my life, I watched her performance and felt nothing but a strange, exhausted calm. After the dishes were cleared and the guests had gone, I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. I placed the report in front of her without a word. I watched her read it. I watched the version of Diane I'd been married to for 22 years leave her face entirely, replaced by someone older, tireder, and, for the first time I could remember, completely honest. His name was Daniel, she said quietly, not defending herself, not performing anything anymore. Before we were engaged. It was one time, and I told myself it didn't matter, because you and I were going to build a whole life together and none of that seemed real anymore once we did. She looked at the report again, then at me. I never told you because I convinced myself it would break something that didn't need to be broken. And somewhere in the last few years, I stopped being sure I ever really loved you the way I loved the idea of the life we'd built. I'm sorry. I never really loved you, Marcus. Not the way you deserve to be loved. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw the report across the room. I asked her one question, how long she'd known herself that Ethan might not be mine. She said she'd wondered quietly for years and had simply chosen never to find out. I told her I already had a lawyer. I told her I'd known for 6 days and that I'd suspected far longer than that. The photograph in the shoebox, the coffee shop receipt, the car parked 2 houses down on Tuesday evenings. I watched her face when I laid it out, piece by piece, in the same flat, procedural tone I used to walk a warehouse manager through a shipping discrepancy. I watched the last part of her composure, the part that had believed, right up until that moment, that she was still the one steering this conversation, finally give way. She didn't cry the way people cry in the stories I'd half expected our life to become. She just sat very still, hands flat on the table, and said quietly that she hadn't expected me to already know so much. How long have you known about Daniel? I asked her. She said she told herself for years it was a closed chapter, something that belonged to a version of herself from before our marriage even started, and that somewhere along the way she'd simply stopped letting herself ask the question that mattered. I asked if she'd ever planned to tell me, if Ethan hadn't gotten sick, if that hospital form had never existed. She was honest, at least, in that final moment. She said no. She said she would have carried it the rest of her life rather than risk what telling me might have cost her. The following weeks moved with a kind of procedural order I'm grateful for now, even though none of it felt orderly at the time. Rob filed the separation paperwork within days, structured around a house we'd paid off together regardless of whose name was on Ethan's birth certificate, and a retirement account we'd both built over 23 years of actual marriage. Diane didn't contest much. I don't think she had the appetite for it, not after that Saturday. She moved out of the master bedroom that same week and slept in what had been Ethan's childhood room, the one with the faded baseball wallpaper we'd never gotten around to replacing, until the paperwork with her mother's address was finalized. We told our small circle of friends the truth in pieces, over the following month, in the same measured tone I'd used at the kitchen table. Most people were kind about it, in the careful way people are kind when they don't yet know how to feel about news like that. A few, including one of the 2 couples we'd had dinner with for over a decade, drifted away entirely, unsure which of us to keep in their lives. I found I minded that less than I expected to. 22 years teaches you which friendships were ever really yours and which ones were simply adjacent to a marriage. Ethan's surgery went ahead as scheduled. I was, in the end, a genetic mismatch and could not be his donor, but Paul, who had quietly begun his own compatibility testing the week I first called him, was cleared instead and gave his nephew a kidney on a Tuesday morning in early December. I sat in the same waiting room I'd sat in months earlier, and this time I didn't need to do any math at all. I just waited for my son to come out of surgery, Because whatever the paperwork said, that was still exactly what he was to me. I told Ethan the truth myself, 3 weeks after his surgery, once he was strong enough to hear it without it costing him anything medically. I told him plainly, biology is one fact about a person, and it is not the only one, and it was never going to change how I showed up for him. He cried. So did I, for the first time through this entire ordeal. Then he asked if we could still go to the Rockies game we'd had tickets for since March. We went. Diane moved into her mother's house that same month, and the divorce was finalized 8 months later, quietly, without either of us raising our voices in a courtroom the way half the couples I've since met seem to need to. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying calm for those 6 days, if I wish I'd confronted her the moment I saw the numbers on that hospital monitor. I don't. 23 years of running an operation across 4 states taught me that the worst decisions get made by the person who reacts first and thinks second. Diane and I still see each other at Ethan's milestones, his graduation, the day he moved into his own apartment, the anniversary of his transplant, which he now marks every December the way some families mark a birthday. We're civil. We've had to be for his sake and honestly, for our own. What I know now, and didn't fully understand at 49 sitting in that vinyl chair, is that a single line on a form can tell you about biology, but it can't tell you a single thing about fatherhood. I drove Ethan to his college apartment myself, 3 months after the divorce was finalized, and helped him carry a mattress up 2 flights of stairs the same way I'd carried furniture into our first apartment with Diane a lifetime earlier. He is, in every way that has ever mattered to me, my son. Type O positive. Type AB negative. Type A positive. Numbers on a screen a nurse typed without knowing what they'd cost. They told me the truth about one thing. They never once told me who my son was.